In this session, we are going to discuss the Marxist perspective on state. You will certainly remember that in the last two sessions, we discussed in very great detail the liberal perspective on state. The Marxist perspective on state, which primarily developed in the 19th century, and a perspective which is associated with the name of Karl Marx. Well, this is a kind of perspective which developed predominantly in two distinct phases. One phase, which we will discuss in this particular session, that is associated largely with the names of Karl Marx and his friend, his lifelong companion, Friedrich Engels. In the second phase, we will examine how this Marxist perspective, which originated with Marx and Engels, was further developed by a number of very distinguished theorists, primarily in the 20th century. Now, the Marxist perspective, it is a challenge to the liberal perspective. It is a challenge to the liberal perspective in two respects. First, the Marxist perspective contests the liberal understanding that the state is the result of a consensus. Second, the Marxist perspective also believes in the proposition, and that in fact is the guiding principle of the Marxist understanding of the state, that the state is an instrument of oppression in the hands of the ruling class, that it is an instrument of coercion, it is an instrument of violence. On the basis of these two elements, which constitute the core of the Marxist perspective on state, we will discuss in this session in detail what exactly is meant by the Marxist understanding, what are the ramifications of this particular orientation. A very well-known British scholar, Ralph Miliband, he in fact has made a distinction between two types of understanding of state which we come across in the writings of Marx. The first understanding or the first viewpoint, that is sometimes known as the primary viewpoint, and this other viewpoint which we come across in the later writings of Marx, that is known as the secondary viewpoint. So we have to make a distinction between the primary view of state and the secondary view of state. Now, we have to keep in mind one thing, that it is the primary view of state which is generally regarded as the popular understanding of state associated with Marx. That is the kind of understanding, that is the primary view of state, which is regarded universally as the core of the Marxist understanding. The secondary understanding, which is a more sophisticated understanding, which is primarily discussed in the academic circles, well, this is a kind of viewpoint which we will also have to discuss first after discussing the primary viewpoint. Now, what is meant by this primary viewpoint or the primary view of state associated with Marx? Marx developed this understanding, and this was shared by his friend Engels in his early writings and also in the writings of his middle period. For example, all of you are familiar with Marx's very famous text. In fact, it was composed jointly by Marx and Engels, that is the Communist Manifesto. In Communist Manifesto and in a number of writings, Marx developed this primary view of state. What does it mean? The primary view of state tries to first of all trace the origin of the state. So far as the origin of the state is concerned, Marx tries to argue, and this was in detail endorsed by Engels and which was discussed very elaborately by Engels in his later writings. The sum and substance, the essence of this primary viewpoint is this, that the state originated because of the need for preservation of private property. Now, why did or how did private property emerge? The arguments of Marx and Engels are as follows. They try to suggest that the state emerged because at the dawn of civilization, there was actually no need of state. But at the dawn of civilization, especially as the civilization gradually began to advance, what happened was, eventually at a particular stage of development, they developed a sort of surplus production, the notion of surplus production. This surplus production, the surplus product, it was felt by a section of society, by some individuals, that this surplus product needs to be appropriated and converted into private property. Now, if you are interested in accumulation of private property and retaining your hold on private property, then obviously you require certain institutions, you require certain mechanisms with the help of which you will have to retain this hold. And that requires, that is, this necessity demands that you require certain mechanisms of oppression. That is, you require certain mechanisms with the help of which you will be able to tell the people, look, I am more powerful than you. That is a sense of fear that will be instilled into the minds of the majority. This is how the state emerged in the earliest stage of civilization, and that led to a division in society between what Marx calls classes, that is, those who owned the means of production, those who controlled the surplus product, and those who constitute the majority and who were victims of this system. So this goes into the making of the state. This is the explanation which, with reference to which one has to explain how the state originated. And therefore, the state historically, as it evolved throughout the ages, it became an instrument of force and violence. So this is the primary view of Marx. However, Marx and Engels also try to argue that the state, of course, developed as a coercive institution, as an institution of force and violence, but eventually what happens is that when the state reaches, that is, the state as a coercive institution, when it reaches its most advanced stage, and that most advanced stage is capitalism. Capitalism, that is the rule of the market, the rule of capital. Now, under capitalism, according to Marx and Engels, the state reaches its most advanced and sophisticated form. And the capitalist state eventually is overthrown through a revolution by the working class, that is called the proletariat. Because you can very well understand the rise of the state as a coercive institution that led to a sort of fundamental split in society, split between those who constituted the property-less majority and those who constituted the propertied minority. So eventually, it is the property-less majority which rises up in revolt. It indulges in an act of revolution, and through that act of revolution, the oppressive state is destroyed. This reaches a climax under capitalism. So the capitalist state ultimately is overthrown and it is replaced by socialist state, which is fundamentally different from the capitalist state. It is fundamentally different in the sense that for the first time, state power comes into the hands of the majority. But according to Marx, since the state itself is an oppressive institution, and since after the socialist revolution, the state is taken over by the oppressed, so eventually the state will no longer be required. That is, the state, according to Marx, finally withers away. And this stage is called communism. But before communism, you required a transitory stage which Marx describes as socialism. So under socialism, you still require the state, but its nature, its character, its essence is qualitatively different from the nature of the capitalist state. It is different because it is now a state which is controlled by the working class, which is controlled by the propertyless majority, and therefore it is a state which is non-exploitative. So this is basically or essentially the primary view of state. Now let us take a quick look at the secondary view of state. The secondary view of state, I have already said, it is a more sophisticated, more refined understanding of state. This is the kind of version which we come across in the later writings of Marx, especially in his historical writings. Now, in these writings, and the focal point of which is Marx's very important celebrated text that is known as the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which Marx wrote in the early 50s of the 19th century. Now, in that text, what Marx tried to argue was this. Essentially, it means this, that it's quite often happens, a situation like this quite often takes place. And this is what happened in 19th century France, the middle of the 19th century, that when the state itself maybe is controlled by a particular class, which is not perhaps typical representative of the capitalist class, but actually, since the state is a product of a particular stage of society, that is historically the society has developed the capitalist stage, so the state objectively represents, the state objectively symbolizes the interests of the capitalist class. That is, it may so happen that the different wings of state, the different organs of state, well, these are controlled by different classes. Maybe one wing is controlled by a particular section, another wing is controlled by another section, but eventually, ultimately, the state, it is a kind of structure which objectively represents the interests of the capitalist class. Now, this is, for instance, what happened in middle of 19th century France. In France, Louis Bonaparte, he was, formally speaking, perhaps a representative of a section of the peasantry, but actually, ultimately, objectively, he spoke in defense of the interests of the propertied capitalist class. So this, broadly speaking, is the notion of the secondary view. Now, the difference between the primary view and the secondary view is this. The primary view tries to suggest that the state is necessarily a kind of institution or structure which has to be examined with reference to the class which controls it. Whereas, in the secondary view, the focus is not so much on class, rather the focus is on the structure, the organization, the constituent elements of the state. So, sometimes it is argued that whereas the first view, the primary viewpoint, this believes or this suggests that it is a sort of instrumentalist understanding of state. That is, the state is an instrument in the hands of the ruling class. Whereas the other view, which talks of the rather relatively autonomous structure of the state, here the focus is primarily on the structure itself, on the structure, the constituent elements, the organization of the state, not so much on the class itself. Now, these two perspectives of Marx, which was developed by Marx himself and also by Engels. Now, these two perspectives eventually led to a kind of very interesting debate in the 1970s of the last century. This debate is sometimes known as the Miliband-Poulantzas debate. That is, it is a debate which took place in the 1970s, primarily after the publication of a book that was written by Ralph Miliband, a British Marxist, and his viewpoint, his understanding was contested by a French philosopher. He was originally born in Greece, but later he settled down in France, Nikos Poulantzas. So, Poulantzas contested the position of Miliband, and Miliband and Poulantzas, they entered into a very interesting and sophisticated debate on these two perspectives of the Marxist understanding of state. To talk about this debate very briefly, the understanding is something like this. First, let us listen to Ralph Miliband. What was Miliband's understanding? Miliband's position was primarily a defense of the instrumentalist understanding of state. That is, Ralph Miliband tried to suggest the state is an instrument in the hands of the ruling class. Now what does it mean? It means, he argues, and of course the reference point was the modern capitalist state. So Ralph Miliband's viewpoint was this, that if we look at the modern capitalist state, then we will find that the key positions, the key wings of the government, they are all manned by people who are necessarily representatives of the propertied class. And therefore, the state is actually an instrument in the hands of the ruling class. Miliband argues, well, there may be one or two elements, there may be some persons in the government who do not share the interests of the propertied class, but ultimately, since it is a state which is manned by, since the different wings of the state, they are controlled by representatives of the propertied class, so it is evident that the modern state, it is an instrument in the hands of the ruling class. This was Miliband's understanding. Poulantzas's position was quite different. Poulantzas's argument was this, that it is immaterial whether the wings of the government, the different elements, the different constituents of the modern capitalist state, they are controlled by the propertied class, by the representatives or agents of the propertied class. According to Poulantzas, the modern capitalist state is structured in such a sophisticated manner, it is organized in such a refined and complex manner, that whoever be in charge of the state is bound to serve the interests of the capitalist class. That is, according to Poulantzas, that even if you bring in some people, some element who are not representatives of the propertied class, the state is structured in such a way, the state is organized in such a way that you have no other alternative but to serve the interests of the capitalist class. So this is the understanding of Poulantzas. That is, Miliband, his focus is on the agency, whereas Poulantzas's position is on the structure. According to Miliband, the state is virtually, the modern capitalist state is virtually controlled by agents of the capitalist class, the representatives of the capitalist class, and therefore the state is an instrument in the hands of the capitalist class. Whereas Poulantzas's understanding is that it is actually not very relevant for us to locate the class origins of the personnel. The personnel are virtually victims of a particular structure. Once the personnel, whatever be your origin, whether you are of working class origin or whether you are of, say, capitalist origin, you are bound to serve the interests of the particular kind of state, that is the modern capitalist state. You are just like a cog in the wheel of a machine. So this was the position of Poulantzas. You can very well guess that these two perspectives, one perspective shared by Miliband, the other perspective shared by Poulantzas, well, these are two positions which are, very broadly speaking, representatives of the two viewpoints which I have earlier discussed. That is the primary view and the secondary view. Ralph Miliband's position is representative of the primary view, whereas Poulantzas's position is representative of the secondary view. But interestingly, if we follow the debate that took place between Ralph Miliband and Poulantzas, and if we also try to look at the subsequent understanding which was developed by Miliband and Poulantzas, because they did not just stop with this debate. Miliband talked about the Marxist understanding of state in his later writings. Poulantzas also talked about the Marxist understanding of state in his later writings. So if we just try to follow how they developed their viewpoints of state, then we will see that there was a subtle shift in Ralph Miliband's position, as well as there was also a slight change in the understanding of Poulantzas. That is, there was a shift in Miliband's understanding, there was a shift in Poulantzas's understanding. Now, what were these shifts? Basically, although it is a fact that the point which I have already emphasized, that is, Miliband talked in terms of instrumentalist understanding. Miliband was talking or thinking in terms of an agency or agent, whereas Poulantzas was talking or thinking in terms of structure. What we come across in the understanding of Miliband is this. Miliband eventually conceded. Miliband eventually, in his later writings, endorsed the point that yes, the state is primarily an instrument in the hands of the ruling class, but still we have to admit that the state retains a sort of structural autonomy. It retains a sort of structural autonomy in the sense that according to Miliband, the modern capitalist state is so complex, it is organized in such a sophisticated way that one has to accept the point that the state is not just a sort of representative in the hands of the ruling class. That is, the state is a highly sophisticated structure, and therefore the state has a compelling sort of impact on the members who control the state. In other words, whether you are a representative of the ruling class or not, that of course for Miliband is very, very important. But for Miliband, this is also a point which he accepts, which he concedes, that despite the fact, despite the acceptance of the fact, despite the acceptance of the reality, that predominantly, primarily, the modern capitalist state, yes, it is controlled by the agents, by the representatives of the capitalist class. Despite all these things, the other factor also we cannot ignore. That is, the state is bound to represent, the state is bound to symbolize, the state is bound to act as a kind of structure, a kind of institution which represents objectively the interests of the capitalist class. So far as Poulantzas's later writings are concerned, Poulantzas no longer is talking in terms of a fixed abstract structure frozen in time and space. Poulantzas eventually shifts his understanding to a more complex level. Poulantzas argues in his later writings that the state actually is a kind of site. The state actually is a kind of arena, the essence of which, the character of which, the nature of which is shaped by the course of class struggle which takes place in this arena. The direction of this class struggle, the thrust of this class struggle, this cannot be anticipated, or this is not predetermined. And therefore, according to Poulantzas, it is not just the abstract structure which is important. What is important is that one has to locate the site of the class struggle. Finally, by way of conclusion, what we have to therefore appreciate is that although popularly the Marxist understanding of state is generally associated with the primary view, it is also to be admitted, it is also to be acknowledged, it is also to be recognized that the Marxist understanding of state is not just this kind of very simplified understanding, and which actually is the popular understanding of the Marxist view of state, that the state is an instrument, simply an instrument in the hands of the ruling class. The state is an instrument of violence and oppression. This simplistic understanding of the state, which was revised by Marx himself in his later writings, and as a result of which the primary view of state of Marx was revised by Marx himself, and which went into the making of the secondary view of Marx. Well, This secondary view, you will understand, this became actually a major or focal point of discussion in the debate between Miliband and Poulantzas. That is, there is no one singular view of state associated with Marxism. There are two viewpoints. One is the primary view, the other is the secondary view. The primary view focuses on a very simplified, a simplistic understanding of state. The secondary view focuses on a more complex, sophisticated understanding of state. In our second phase, that is in our next session, what we'll have to discuss is primarily these two viewpoints. That is, how in the later phase, how in the 20th century, it is these two views of underlying the Marxist perspective, one the primary view and the secondary view, how these two viewpoints were developed by the later interpreters of the Marxist view of state. Thank you.